So hi, everybody. My name is Leandra Fernandez. I'm originally from India, but I've been living in Australia for the last 7 years. And I'm currently doing my PhD with the Center for Planetary Health and Food Security at Griffith University. So like Nozomi mentioned, I did face a lot of challenges during data collection in Timor-Leste and Solomon Islands, but I will tell you a bit more about those challenges at the end of the presentation when we have our discussions. So for this presentation, I'm just going to be sort of giving you a part of the PhD, which is on understanding the social and gender dynamics of the fall armyworm on smallholder farmers. And what I was really interested to see was farmers' intentions towards adopting integrated pest management in these two countries. So this is just the structure of my presentation for today. I'll be providing you with the introduction to this research and some of the research gaps that I found out when I did my literature review, the objectives of the study, just a bit about the theoretical framework, the methodologies that I've used, and so just the results, conclusions, and recommendations. So a lot of you know fall armyworm. It is a notorious pest of maize. It's native to the Americas, but it rapidly made its way across to Africa in 2016, 2017, Asia 2018, 2019, and then in Timor-Leste in 2020, also Australia around that time. And in 2021, it made its way to the Pacific country of Solomon Islands. This is a very fast-flying pest, and yeah, it has in just a few years it has made its way across the world. And there were some recent detections even made in Vanuatu in 2023. So I'll talk about more into why I chose Timor-Leste and Solomon Islands, but just a bit about the fall armyworm in these two countries. Fall armyworm was first detected in the municipalities of Likasa and Baucau in March 2020 in Timor-Leste. Now, again, there's not much information that I could find online, but maize is a commonly grown crop in Timor-Leste after rice. It's grown by more than 100,000 smallholder farmers. And there was a food security assessment that was conducted by the World Food Programme in 2020. And they found that around the time that fall armyworm got into Timor-Leste, smallholder farmers were already dealing with the African swine flu and COVID-19. So the combination of these three had some really serious impacts because fall armyworm had caused damage to 90% of the maize crop in that first year. So there was loss of maize for household consumption. There was loss of maize as stock feed for poultry, and then there was also loss of poultry as a source of protein, and that severely threatened the livelihoods of smallholder farmers in Timor. First reason why I decided this country, or being an island nation, would be a good country to look into, to look at the impacts of this pest. The Solomon Islands, on the other hand, there's not many maize growers over there. Like it's quite a few. It's just a small number of maize growers, but they do grow a lot of root crops. They grow some other crops like sweet potato, pumpkin, tomato, cucumber, cabbage, and peanuts. And these are all considered to be host crops of the fall armyworm. So I was interested to even talk to the farmers and see if they'd seen fall armyworm damage on other crops besides maize, and what sort of an impact was it having on smallholder farmers in the Solomon Islands. So my reason for looking at understanding gender dynamics is women represent 43% of the agricultural labor workforce, especially in developing countries, but they often do not have the same access to resources or training as much as men. But if they did, there could be an increase in yield by 20 to 30%, reducing hunger by 12 to 17%. This was in an article by FAO in 2015. And now that's a significant gain. So in the study, I am recognizing that men and women have different roles and responsibilities, particularly in pest and disease management. And I'm interested to see how can we increase, so recognizing these roles, how can we increase the uptake of crop protection technologies in order to improve or to support or to improve the uptake of IPM by providing gender appropriate support. IPM, it is knowledge intensive. You do need a certain level of education. And for that, you need to have access to the latest information and resources. So keeping that in mind, this was some of the gaps that I found in the literature. Plenty of research that has been done on the fall armyworm in Africa, in Asia. There's not much that's on smallholder farmers in Timor-Leste or the Pacific. It's relatively new to the Pacific. Knowledge and perceptions, again, limited knowledge on farmers' perceptions and knowledge of the pest. No information at all on farmers' awareness on IPM. I did come across a couple of articles where in the Solomon Islands, farmers have been trained to use IPM for giant African snail and coconut rhinoceros beetle. But during my time there, I got to know that they are not actually completely involved. It's mostly the biosecurity officers that would do most of the IPM, like putting out the fungus, but then farmers would do more of the physical work, wherein like sanitation was a part of it. So they were not directly involved, or they didn't really have much knowledge in IPM. I was also interested to look at the roles of men and women because there's limited knowledge on this. And this study hopefully helps to answer a lot of these or cover a lot of these gaps. So these are my primary objectives. So assessing the impact of this pest on individual livelihoods, that's both men and women farmers, documenting experiences as well as challenges of men and women farmers and even extension officers, and investigating alternative livelihood pest management. And in order to do this investigation of alternative livelihood pest management, I was interested to first see what is it that the farmers are currently doing to manage this pest, because it's always good to work with the existing knowledge. If you're helping the farmers, you can't just go and tell them to do something. You need to see what is it that they're currently doing, what is the effectiveness of what they're currently doing, and then build up on that. So with that, this is my overall conceptual framework where I wanted to look at farmers' behaviors, so their attitudes towards the pest and the control strategies that they're using. Subjective norms, are they currently doing what they're doing because their friends and family are doing so? Are they facing any issues? So that's a perceived behavioral control aspect of it. Are the strategies cost effective? Is it time consuming? Does that have an impact on their intention to adopt IPM? Are they aware of the negative consequences of using pesticides? And how would all of this affect their intention to adopt IPM? This all plays a role. So you've got experiences of farmers as well as extension officers, male and men and women, in managing the fall armyworm, how that affects behaviors. You've got the effectiveness of the control strategies. You've got chemical, biological, cultural control, how that has an impact on gender roles and decision-making, and how, again, all of that affects farmers' intentions to adopt. This is my dependent variable, which is integrated pest management. So with the theory that I just spoke about, this is my theoretical model. I've combined theory of plant behavior and norm activation theory. And this is going to help me understand why is it, because IPM has been around for ages. So I'm really interested to know why is it that it's not readily adopted in some of the countries. And this theory, or using this theoretical model, which is what it looks like right now, I used a software called JASP. This will help me understand, and I'm also going to be using gender and education as my moderators to further look at how all of this affects farmers' intentions to adopt more sustainable strategies. So this is just a map of my study sites that I selected. In Timor-Leste, I chose 4 sites. Now, I was only able to spend about a month over there because I'm still an Indian citizen, so I only had a month-long visa. And so I chose 4 different sites, and I was able to spend maximum number of time in these sites to collect my data. Kovalima and Manufahi, lots of maize grown in these areas. The reason I chose Elmira and Dili is because I wanted to see whether farmers in these two areas use a lot more chemicals as compared to Covalima and Manufahi, because Dili is a capital, and that's where a lot of the chemicals are easily available. In Solomon Islands, like Nozomi mentioned earlier, quite a few challenges. I was just able to concentrate on this area. First of all, in Guadalcanal Plains, which is one of the main provinces, the terrain is very difficult to access. Past Aola, you need a boat to go across to any of the other areas. And during that time, it was just towards the end of the monsoon. So a lot of the bridges that sort of connect this area to the West Guadalcanal Plains had collapsed. So I was not able to travel to these areas. I was not able to travel to Malaita, which was another province where maize is commonly grown because of elections, the upcoming elections, and there was a lot of turmoil in the country and in the other provinces around that time. So this was the methods that I chose for the study. I conducted face-to-face surveys using Kobo Toolbox. In Timor-Leste, I was able to survey a total of 110 farmers. In the Solomons, it was slightly smaller because there's not many maize growers, but also there were a lot of challenges which kind of affected my data collection. Excuse me. For one of the examples I'd like to give here is there were not enough, so extension officers were not available that entire time to show me where exactly to travel to collect data in the Solomons, because the farms are really scattered, even in that small area. And they had double booked themselves. And so the way I tried to overcome this hurdle was to just travel to the markets by myself and try to find farmers who'd be able to speak in English or communicate in English and just survey them. But then I did have the help of some biosecurity officers later, who then helped me to talk to some of the farmers in these markets, which was great. I also conducted key information. So I did some interviews, in-depth interviews with extension officers, research officers, and lead farmers. So that was 46 in total over there. So this is just a graph, or pie chart, sorry, to show my sample. Over here, I wanted to make note that the number of, so the women actually belong to the younger age group as compared to men. But when it came to the number of farmers that had no education, the number of women farmers that had no education in both the countries was a lot higher compared to the men. There was a question on yield reduction. So that was just the damage or how farmers perceive the damage by the fall armyworm to be. Here, I was interested to see how men and women perceived the damage, whether that was different or whether it was the same. So across all the sites that were selected, you can see both men and women farmers did say that the damage, like, was much damage, which is 11 to 20% yield reduction. But there were a couple of farmers in Covalima, and a lot of the women farmers in some of the other sites did say that the damage was quite severe. In Covalima, the damage was so bad on some of the farms that were managed by women, that because they didn't receive any assistance or didn't receive any information at all in that first few years since the detection of the fall armyworm, that they lost most of their maize crop, so much so that they've stopped growing or planting maize altogether. In Solomon Islands, there's a small percentage of female farmers that did report the damage to being a lot more compared to what the men farmers perceived it to be. So another question I had was on other crops that they saw fall armyworm damage on. So this is just based on farmers reporting. I was interested to see this myself, but because I didn't travel at the right time, they were not intercropping with pumpkin, sweet potato, or vegetables. I did see some damage on beans, but I can't tell you for sure whether there was any fall armyworm damage on sweet potatoes or pumpkin. But farmers did report quite a bit of damage on rice, so moderate to severe, and they did say that they saw fall armyworm damage on these other crops too. Same goes for the Solomon Islands as well. Overall, when I asked them about their damage, whether it was significant, not so significant, or very significant, all the farmers said that it was significant, with a few farmers reporting that it was not so significant. But there's quite a few of the women farmers that did say that the damage from fall armyworm was very significant. And these women farmers also reported that fall armyworm infestations in 2023 was much higher than when they first found it on their farm. So now I'm just going to go into some of the effectiveness of the current control strategies that farmers are using. I've divided the strategies into cultural, biological, and chemical. So with cultural control or mechanical control, none of the farmers were actually properly monitoring or scouting their field because they were not aware of the best ways to monitor or scout. They just randomly checked their plants to see if there was any damage from the fall armyworm. Women farmers didn't like hand picking and crushing of the larvae because they found it quite icky. None of the farmers were using or knew of any improved resistant varieties. Farmers that were intercropping with legumes and beans did say that the damage was a lot less compared to the other farmers. When it came to applying wood ashes and soil, again, not many farmers were aware of this, but the farmers that were aware of the strategy were the farmers, men farmers who had attended training. Farmers were frequently weeding, but in Kovalima and Manufahi, they were using a lot of herbicides. And the herbicides were easily accessible in those two municipalities. So you had men spraying a lot of the herbicides, but the physical weeding was done by women. Weeding did help to keep down fall armyworm populations. Now, the other strategy that I did come across in Timor-Leste, which I found quite interesting, was a traditional one. I'm going to go back to the slide because if you look at this bamboo plant, farmers in Timor-Leste call it fafuli. So what the farmers told me was that they put this bamboo in the middle of the field and in the four corners around that middle bamboo. And what the bamboo was doing was pushing or like getting rid of the fall armyworms. So unknowingly, they were using that push-pull technology. So pushing the fall armyworm away, but they didn't have anything on the borders of the field to attract the fall armyworms. So the pull technology pull part of the technology was missing. So this is something we can build up on. When I looked into effectiveness of biological control strategies, a lot of the women farmers reported seeing chickens or birds feeding on the fall armyworm. So a good strategy to look into over here, where you're combining cultural and biological, is because women hate hand picking and crushing of larvae. They could hand pick the larvae and feed it to the chickens. So you've got cultural and biological right there. With botanicals, like none of the farmers knew about parasitoids, fungi, or viruses. This is quite intensive. When it came to the use of botanicals, chili and lime leaves was one thing that they were commonly using. Some of the farmers had heard about neem through World Vision. They were using tobacco and sand, which was mostly the men farmers. And in Elmera, there were a lot of women farmers that were even making homemade biopesticides. And this was from the information that they had received from a female extension officer in the area. When it came to biopesticides, a lot of the men had attended training on making these biopesticides. And one of that training was on plant-derived biopesticides using Derris elliptica. And in Timor-Leste, they call it tuha. So the thing about Derris elliptica is you crush the roots and the stem of this plant, mix it up with water, and then you leave it overnight or for a few hours, and then you spray it on the fall armyworm, and it paralyzes the fall armyworm. And then the ants come and feed on it. It sounds pretty gross, I know. But yeah, it sounds good and everything. But the thing what I found about Derris is that it's got this chemical called rotenone, which is known to cause Parkinson's if you're using it long, over a longer period of time. So my recommendation here is to use Derris not as a biopesticide, but as a pesticide. So farmers need to be trained to wear protective gear, gloves, glasses, and protective clothing when spraying Derris elliptica. In Elmera, the women farmers that were trained to use chilies said that they did not like using it much because it burned their eyes and skin. So over here, I looked at the use of chemicals. So I did include biopesticides here because of Chuha, which I just mentioned. In Dili and Elmera, in Dili, 100% of the farmers that participated in the survey said that they use pesticides because it's easily accessible in Dili. In Elmera as well, quite a high percentage, so 72% of the farmers were using pesticides. In Covalima and Manufai, it was not so much, but farmers did use a lot of herbicides, like 38% in Covalima and 62% in, 100% in Manufai. Biopesticides was commonly used in, so that's the Tuha was commonly used in Covalima and Manufai, but not so much in Edmera and Dili. In the Solomon Islands, because I was able to only survey farmers living close to Honiara city, 45% of those farmers said that they use pesticides for managing fall armyworm as well as other vegetable pests. So this is just a few pictures and some of the pesticides as well as the herbicides that the farmers are using. In Solomon's, Confida and Otin were the commonly used ones. And in Timor-Leste, it was Damabas, Dushpan, Siramethrin, and Basa. All the farmers said that the chemicals were either effective or very effective. That's how they rated them. Now going into gender roles. So I looked into gender roles, so men and women farmers' roles in performing maize production activities. So these were the different maize production activities. From this graph, you can see that men are quite involved with preparing land for planting, application of fertilizers, because they do consider these to be manually laborious tasks. But women were quite involved with selecting the seeds for the next season, even harvesting, post-harvesting, and selling. In the Solomon Islands, this was seen to be quite a bit because women spent a lot of their time in the fields in Solomon Islands as compared to the men. So similar findings with decision making as well. And in Solomons, you can see that women are quite involved in the decision making on several of the maize production activities. And this is information that was not really available out there. So even when it came to the influence that they had in the decision making, and knowing this or recognizing that, yes, women are very involved in not just performing, but also making decision on not just one or two, but several of the maize production activities. This is an important thing because now we can try and ensure that women have access to resources such as improved crop varieties, better seeds, latest information on crop production, even farming equipment, and training programs that could help to strengthen their decision-making abilities and also their confidence in maize production. We could also help to improve women's access to market prices and buyers because they're quite involved in selling. When we looked at fall armyworm management, you can see that, yes, women are involved with cultural control, biological control, but that decreases to an extent, especially in the Solomon Islands, on attending training on pest and disease management. Even though women are involved with all of those field activities or maize production activities, they hardly ever attend training on pest and disease management because in the Solomons, what happens is invitations are sent to the head of the households. And so it is the men that attend training, and men often fail to then communicate that information to women. Similar thing was found in Timor as well, where if it was the men that attended training, they often failed to communicate what they learned at that training with the women. But women did interact a lot with neighbors and spoke about some of the pest management or what they were doing with one another. To an extent, in Timor, they were also involved with the preparation and use of biopesticides. And they had some level of decision making in choosing what chemicals to buy. And that's in the Solomons as well as in Timor-Leste. So keeping what I just said in mind, I think it's important that knowing that women prefer informal sources, that we work or target their preference for informal sources by improving more community or increasing community-based interactions to facilitate that knowledge sharing, but also targeting religious groups. So a lot of women shared that they usually did tend to gather after a religious ceremony. So they did tend to gather and talk about some of things they would do for farming. They talk about everything else, but they also talk about farming and even pest and disease management. So this could be a thing to look into and targeting these religious groups to offer women with more up-to-date information on pest and disease management. And over here, you can see from this graph that women had more discussions compared to men in Mera and Dili especially, on reducing using non-chemical alternatives. They did show more preference towards sustainable strategies for pest and disease management. And this needs to be targeted when communicating on IPM with women. So talking more about IPM being more sustainable and reducing the use of pesticides. I'll quickly go through these slides because in both of these slides, you can see that women dominated these tasks of financing the farm and household childcare activities, food shopping, and cooking. And they had a lot of influence in both these countries on these activities. So knowing that, yes, women are involved in childcare activities, buying food, and they're involved in finances of the farm and household, recognizing this, we can help improve their access to financial services, loans, or insurances. Another thing I looked into was the role of extension officers in Timor-Leste and the Solomon Islands. So I'm going to be doing a thematic analysis, and I'm still working through the interviews because I just finished out a collection a couple of months ago. But these are just some of the themes that are standing out in terms of challenges or gender challenges that extension officers have been facing. Some of the common challenges include limited government support, corruption, lack of resources like seeds and agricultural equipment. But from the gender challenges, some of the things that really stood out to me was recruitment practices that favor men over women. And yes, of course, lack of transport that limit farmers or extension officers' access to some of the remote part of the villages, unequal pay, and even men extension officers withholding information on training from women. And there was also unequal representation in some of the municipalities in Timor-Leste of men and women, where for 4 women extension officers, you had around 32 men extension officers. When it came to providing training, the women farmers were often unable to attend training because it was at a time that did not suit them, and they were busy with household activities. And extension officers shared that women farmers are not really comfortable asking questions in the presence of a male extension officer. And men farmers were not, this was in the Solomon Islands, they were not comfortable taking instructions from younger female extension officers. Which is why in the survey, I also had questions around receiving information from extension, because I wanted to see what was the percentage of farmers that did receive information from extension and how satisfied were they with that information. One thing that stood out to me here was that in Mera, there were a lot of women that said that they received information, and this was all from that one female extension officer that I was talking about. And they were quite satisfied with the information that they received from her, which was mostly on homemade biopesticides. So some reasons that farmers gave for not being satisfied with the extension included lack of information from extension officers. So often they had to try and figure things out on their own. Then extension officers often favored friends and family. Those that didn't live close to the main road didn't get too much information. And women often, like this is the one I was explaining about before, men would attend training and they would not communicate what they learned during training with their spouses. So they didn't like that extension officers were only sending out invitations to the head of the household. They wanted that invitations would be sent to the entire household, so even women had that opportunity to attend training. I looked into farmers' knowledge on pests and diseases, whether they thought that men had more knowledge or women had more knowledge. In Kovalima, Manufahi, and Dili, the women reported that men had more knowledge. But in Elmera, the women did report that they had more knowledge on pests and diseases because they did receive a lot of training and information from that extension officer, and they were quite involved with pest and disease management in this municipality. Across all sites, women's access to phone was very low compared to men. And from the farmers that said that they had no phones at all, it was the women farmers that was a higher percentage compared to men. So in conclusion, just wanted to say like some of the key things that stood out was that, yes, women in both countries, they do play significant roles in not just the crop production, but also pest management. But they often go unrecognized or under-recognized, not just by themselves, but also by the men and extension systems, particularly in the Solomon Islands. Yes, lack of training information. This was some of the reasons that they said that they were not adopting any control strategies, because there were some farmers that were not doing anything at all because they didn't know what to do. Most of the women farmers said that they didn't like using chemicals because it was affecting the health environment, and they would like to learn about IPM. So this is the bit where I was looking at farmers' attitudes. So that's one of the things that came out from that. In Guadalcanal Plains, women farmers are involved in making some of the decisions on what pesticides to buy, especially the ones living closer to Honiara City. And farmers did say that because of fall armyworm, their production costs had increased considerably, and sometimes they didn't have enough maize to consume at home. So just from that, some of the recommendations. So this is just a few recommendations. I do have a lot more. With IPM being knowledge intensive, we need to think about some more innovative ways where we just not communicate about IPM or think about gender, but also think about how to communicate IPM to men and women farmers, but also ones that can reach the uneducated population. And like I mentioned at the start, we need to build up on existing knowledge. It is important to see what is it that the farmers are currently doing, which is what I've done in the study, and then build up on that to improve the uptake of IPM. There are some control measures that women farmers are using based on traditional knowledge. This can be a starting point, especially in island nations where there's not many resources or the resources are limited. Island nations, it is difficult for the farmers out there. They are struggling. They continue to require lots of support from international organizations, government, research institutions, and farmers. But identifying some of the grassroots organizations, which I was able to do during my time in the Solomon Islands, and then funding projects through these grassroots organizations can help. In this manner, we can help to not only start something. So, for example, if you're training farmers in IPM, start training farmers in IPM, but then we can continue to monitor the progress of those farmers for many years, not just stopping it after a year or two. That's important. Need to continue monitoring the progress of projects. We need to develop capacity building projects on IPM, which take into account women's needs and preferences. So that is making sure training is at a time that is suitable for women. It does not go on for too long, but it's just at a suitable time, a suitable amount of time, and in a suitable location to increase women's participation. We also need to try and find ways, because IPM, it can be time consuming. So we need to find some IPM strategies that are not time consuming. And we need to promote this time and labor saving technologies, wherein it's not a burden for women, but it's actually easing the burden or workload on women farmers. Similarly, for extension officers, need to encourage more women to work as agricultural extension, but that can only be done by first tackling some of those problems or challenges that I've already mentioned, with accessibility to transport, ensuring equal pay, and revising the current recruitment practice to be more gender inclusive, balanced, and diverse. And we need to include more practical IPM training at the university level, particularly for extension officers, who can then tailor these programs for farmers. And this is a much needed thing in Pacific nations. So just in conclusion, I would really like to thank Nozomi because she has been an integral part of my journey in this PhD, guiding me throughout. So I'd really like to thank Nozomi for that. I'd also like to thank CGIAR, Griffith University, the Crawford Fund for the funding that I received for this PhD, as well as the in-country organizations that helped me with data collection. Thank you.